Before we begin today's story, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments. I love knowing where my amazing YouTube family is tuning in from. Now, imagine this. A young waitress spots a lonely, crying baby sitting all alone in a corner of a diner. She gently picks him up, not knowing that someone is secretly watching her, someone powerful, someone rich, and someone emotionally broken. What happens next? It's a story about love born in silence, hearts healed by kindness, and how one simple act can change everything. Stay with me until the end, because this isn't just a love story. It's a life lesson you'll never forget. This is Waitress Helps Lonely Baby. What the secretly watching millionaire did next will break you. Now get cozy. Grab some tissues. Because this story will touch your soul. Love. It was a chilly Tuesday morning in Charleston when the golden sunrise poured through the frosted glass windows of Rosie's diner, casting a warm glow over steaming coffee mugs and the gentle chatter of regulars starting their day. But for Emma Collins, a 27-year-old waitress with tired eyes and a heart too big for her own good, the day would be anything but ordinary. As she bustled between booths with her notepad and warm smile, her gaze caught something that froze her mid-step. A tiny baby boy, no older than one, sitting alone in the corner booth, his cheeks wet with tears, trembling hands clutching the edge of the table like a lifeline, soft golden curls framing a face crumpled in quiet sorrow, too young to understand abandonment, too innocent to deserve it. Her breath caught in her throat as she approached, instincts overriding everything else. She didn't ask who he belonged to or why no one was with him. She simply scooped him gently into her arms like he was made of porcelain, cradling him against her chest, rocking him slowly as he hiccuped into her uniform, her voice breaking into a soft, shaky lullaby. She hadn't sung in years, one her own mother used to sing on nights. She cried for her missing father. The diner seemed to hush around her, forks pausing mid-air, conversation fading as the strange scene unfolded. Yet Emma was only focused on the baby, rubbing slow circles on his tiny back, whispering, "You're safe now, sweetheart," as if she could protect him from every pain the world would ever try to throw at him. Little did she know, behind a copy of the Wall Street Journal and tinted sunglasses, a man sat at the far end of the diner watching the scene unfold, with a face carved from stone, his jaw clenched, his heart warring with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Ethan Maxwell, 35, billionaire tech mogul, genius inventor, the man who built an empire on logic and control, and the one who'd failed to protect the most precious thing his late wife had left him, their son. He'd only turned his back for a few minutes when the temporary nanny, recommended by a top agency, had disappeared, leaving Liam alone, frightened and vulnerable in a place where he should have been protected. And now, here was this stranger, this waitress, with tired shoes and kind eyes, holding his baby like he was her whole world. No questions, no judgment, just pure, instinctual compassion. Something twisted in Ethan's chest, guilt, maybe, or awe, or something he wasn't ready to name, something terrifyingly close to gratitude. But he stayed in the shadows, unable to step forward, unable to reveal himself, haunted by the image of his wife in a hospital bed, begging him to be both parents to their child, and wondering if this moment, this woman, this strange twist of fate, could possibly be the start of redemption. Emma, still unaware of the eyes locked on her every movement, wiped the boy's tears with the edge of her apron, whispering soft promises she didn't even realize she was making. "I won't leave you alone." "You're okay now. Someone loves you," while a single tear slipped down Ethan's cheek behind the dark shield of his glasses, unnoticed by everyone except himself, a man who hadn't cried in 10 years. And in that fragile, breathless moment in a small-town diner, lives that had never meant to cross, suddenly collided, not with thunder or chaos, but with the simple sound of a baby's sob turning into a sigh of safety, and a waitress's voice weaving comfort into the silence, as the man with the power to change her life watched from the shadows, his soul unknowingly beginning to thaw for the very first time. Ethan rose from his booth with slow, deliberate steps, his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest, eyes still fixed on Emma as she gently held Liam, completely unaware that the man she comforted the child for was now standing just feet away, his towering presence casting a long shadow over the floor. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp enough to make Emma turn abruptly, startled to see a sharply dressed stranger with piercing blue eyes hidden behind sleek sunglasses, his tailored charcoal coat brushing the side of the table as he nodded toward the baby in her arms, his voice low and guarded. "That's my son." Emma blinked, unsure if she should feel relief or alarm, her arms tightening around the baby protectively before she slowly handed him over, her voice trembling as she said, "He was crying. I didn't see anyone with him." Ethan took Liam into his arms, but the boy immediately whimpered, stretching his tiny arms back toward Emma, his face scrunched with distress, and Ethan felt a sharp pang of failure he couldn't hide. "The nanny disappeared," Ethan muttered, more to himself than her, but she caught it, her brows furrowing with disbelief. "Who leaves a baby in a diner?" And before she could ask, he added, "She was vetted, background checked, still vanished like smoke," bitterness biting into his tone. Emma didn't flinch, didn't judge, just nodded slowly, her fingers brushing her apron as if grounding herself in the moment, until Ethan asked, "Why do you help him?" with a mixture of suspicion and something almost vulnerable buried beneath the layers of steel in his voice. Emma met his stare, steady and sincere, because he needed comfort. That's all that mattered. Her words pierced something hollow inside him, the part he'd tried to seal away with boardroom schedules and business metrics, and for a moment silence stretched between them, broken only by Liam's soft hiccups as he reached once more for Emma's hand. Ethan glanced at the child, then back at her, confusion dancing behind his stoic exterior. How had this waitress, this complete stranger, managed to soothe the one soul he couldn't reach? "What's your name?" he asked finally, his tone less sharp now, more human. "Emma," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Emma Collins." "I'm Ethan Maxwell," he offered, though her lack of reaction told him the name didn't impress her. She didn't care about Forbes lists or billion-dollar valuations, and that oddly unsettled him. As he looked at the diner, then back to her, he hesitated before blurting out, "Let me give you a ride home. It's the least I can do." Emma's first instinct was to say no, wary of rich men and their promises, but the look in Liam's eyes, how he clung to her as if she were the only light in his tiny world, made her nod, unsure why her heart felt so heavy. They walked to his sleek black SUV parked by the curb. The baby nestled once more in her arms while Ethan opened the door in silence, glancing occasionally at her through the rearview mirror as they drove through the tree-lined streets of Charleston. Small talk came hard, but Liam's soft snore in her lap filled the quiet, until Ethan finally asked the question that had been gnawing at him. "Do you need work?" Emma looked up, caught off guard, replying cautiously, "I have 2 jobs already, but I'm behind on my mom's hospital bills." His grip on the steering wheel tightened, his voice lowering. "Would you consider something different, a live-in nanny position for Liam?" The offer hung heavy in the air like a storm cloud, and Emma sat frozen, weighing the risk against the reality of mounting medical debt and the silent prayers her mother whispered every night for a miracle. "You don't know me," she said finally, not bitter, just honest. "But Liam does," Ethan replied, softer than she expected, the raw truth in his voice startling her more than anything else that day. She looked down at the sleeping boy whose tiny fingers still clutched her shirt, and something shifted in her chest, something maternal, something she hadn't felt since the baby she lost 2 winters ago. "Just for a week," she whispered, unsure who she was trying to convince. "If it doesn't feel right, I'll walk." Ethan nodded, respect flickering in his eyes for her strength, her boundaries, her quiet refusal to be bought. As they pulled up to her apartment complex, a crumbling 3-story walk-up that reeked of mold and regret, Ethan stared at the rusted railings, the cracked window panes, and something in him rebelled against leaving her there. "I'll send a car tomorrow, noon," he said firmly. Emma didn't argue, only gave a faint nod as she stepped out, her arms empty now but her soul curiously full, wondering how a morning shift at a diner had just rewritten the course of her life. Inside his car, Ethan sat still long after she disappeared behind the worn-out door. Liam now cradled quietly in his arms again, and for the first time in years he whispered something to the darkness. "Maybe she's what we both need." The next day, at exactly noon, a sleek black car waited outside Emma's apartment, its polished frame gleaming under the Carolina sun like a gateway to a life she never imagined herself stepping into, and with a borrowed suitcase full of second-hand clothes and a heart heavy with uncertainty, she kissed her mother goodbye and whispered, "Just for a week, Mom," before climbing into the back seat, unaware that those 7 days would stretch far beyond a calendar's hold. The Maxwell estate stood like a modern castle on the edge of town, its towering glass walls reflecting sky and shadow, guarded gates opening to a pristine world of silence, marble, and order, a fortress built to keep chaos and grief out, and perhaps, unknowingly, love too. Emma stepped inside, her worn sneakers echoing against polished floors as she was greeted by staff who barely made eye contact, their movements robotic, efficient, soulless. Liam's tiny footsteps down the grand staircase broke the stiffness, and when he threw himself into her arms with a giggle that echoed through the lifeless halls, something inside the house stirred for the first time, something human. Over the following days, Emma transformed corners of the cold estate into pockets of warmth. She laid down playmats in the sunroom, replaced silence with bedtime stories, and filled empty air with lullabies and laughter that made even the stone walls listen. Liam began to glow, his once distant eyes now bright with trust and affection, clinging to her like a lifeline, as if he had always known her heart would never drop him the way life once did. Ethan, however, watched from the periphery, always composed, always controlled, his eyes shadowed by history and haunted by the ghost of a wife he couldn't save. Addison, the love of his life, who died giving birth to the very child who now found joy again in the arms of a stranger. Emma's presence unnerved him. She was too kind, too warm, too willing to care in a house that had grown used to detachment, and yet, night after night, he found himself lingering at the edge of their moments, overhearing her sing softly to Liam, catching glimpses of her dancing with him barefoot across the kitchen floor, and once, just once, laughing at her own burnt toast. Their interactions were few at first, passing nods, polite words, careful boundaries. But over time, barriers thinned. A conversation about Liam's favorite books turned into a shared story about childhood dreams, and a rainy evening when the power briefly flickered left them sitting at the kitchen island, sipping hot cocoa Emma had made from scratch, and somehow, without intention, they laughed, really laughed, until Ethan stopped himself, startled by how unfamiliar joy felt on his lips. But not all was easy. He snapped often, mistrust flashing like lightning. In moments he felt too close, apologizing in awkward silences rather than words, unsure how to let anyone see the fractures beneath his empire. Emma never pushed, never pried, just listened when he spoke and stayed silent when he couldn't, her empathy speaking louder than advice ever could. Liam, oblivious to adult wounds, began calling her Emmy, his tiny voice echoing through the halls like a song, his fingers always reaching for hers, his giggles chasing away shadows that had long claimed the mansion. Then one quiet evening, as Emma tucked him in beneath a mountain of dinosaur sheets and whispered her usual, "Good night, little man," Liam blinked sleepily and mumbled, "Night, night, mama," before drifting into dreams, his voice soft, innocent, full of pure instinct. Emma froze, breath caught in her throat, heart thudding against her ribs like thunder, unsure whether to cry or correct him. But before she could move, she noticed Ethan standing at the doorway, motionless, eyes wide with a storm of emotion he couldn't hide fast enough. For a moment, silence wrapped the room like glass, fragile, reflective, exposing everything. And as Ethan turned away, she saw the war in his shoulders, the ache of memories pulling him backward, and the terrifying pull of something new dragging him forward. That night, neither of them slept. The name he hadn't heard in so long now echoed in a child's voice, and the woman he'd hired as help had unknowingly started rebuilding a home he thought was lost forever. The weight of Liam's innocent word hung in the air long after the night faded into morning, and the following days passed with a tenderness neither Emma nor Ethan dared name, as though speaking it might shatter whatever fragile thing was blooming between them. The tension that once filled the Maxwell estate had softened into something unspoken, something safer, warmer, glances held longer than necessary, smiles exchanged without cause, a quiet dance of hearts learning to trust again. On a rainy afternoon, the sky weeping softly against the vast windows, Emma found herself sitting across from Ethan in the library, a place he rarely invited anyone into, his sleeves rolled up, the scent of rain and cedar curling between them like an old melody. He asked about her past, not out of obligation, but from genuine curiosity, and for the first time in years, Emma didn't dodge the question, didn't sugarcoat the ache that still clung to her ribs like frost. "I was engaged once," she began, her voice steady but low, "to a man who promised forever but ran at the first sign of struggle." Ethan didn't interrupt, didn't blink, just listened as she stared down at her hands, fingers nervously tracing the curve of a teacup. "When I told him I was pregnant, he disappeared," she whispered, and Ethan's jaw clenched, but he held still. "3 months later, I lost the baby. Alone, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and broken promises." The silence afterward was thick with emotion, Ethan's eyes shimmering with something she hadn't seen in him before. Pain, not just for her, but with her. And in that pause he opened a scar of his own, something he never spoke of, even in therapy or solitude. "My wife, Addison," he murmured, almost inaudibly, "died giving birth to Liam. I wasn't there. I missed her last breath chasing a board meeting in New York." His voice cracked slightly, and Emma's heart lurched, not from pity, but from recognition of that unique ache only grief carriers knew. He turned away then, trying to hide the storm brewing behind his stoic mask, but Emma reached across the table, fingers gently brushing his, as if to say, "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." Their eyes locked in a silence deeper than words, and something electric passed between them, something not loud or reckless, but slow-burning and sacred. Days melted into one another, and the invisible line between employer and employee began to blur with every shared laugh, every whispered story over midnight coffee, every moment their hands touched just a little too long. Liam noticed too, drawing crayon hearts on sticky notes and giggling when he caught them exchanging soft looks. But just as the delicate thread of love began weaving between them, the world outside came crashing in. Suddenly, violently, without warning, Emma woke to her phone buzzing relentlessly, and when she unlocked it, her face went pale. Gossip blogs, social media, headlines screaming in bold betrayal. "Billionaire falls for waitress nanny, hidden romance exposed," accompanied by blurry zoom lens photos of her entering the estate, of her pushing Liam's stroller, of her laughing with Ethan in the garden, all twisted into a cruel narrative. Her heart pounded as she raced downstairs, phone shaking in her hand, only to find Ethan already reading the news on his tablet, his expression unreadable, cold like the day they met. "What is this, Emma?" he asked, voice flat, unfamiliar, as though a wall had reappeared overnight. I would never leak," she began, but he cut her off with a curt wave, eyes flicking up with a storm beneath them. "I trusted you in my home, with my son, with—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but his doubt sliced through her like ice. "You think I did this?" she asked, voice cracking as she took a step back, the sting of betrayal far sharper than any headline. "You said you listened, Ethan, that you saw me." But the man before her now was retreating behind fear and shame, his past ghosts screaming louder than the truth in front of him. "I have to prax." Liam's cries the night before, the hollowness in the house that once felt alive. Then came the twist of fate. Rachel, his assistant of 5 years, stepped into his office with a smirk too subtle to be innocent, and as he confronted her, piecing together her access to security footage, her unauthorized calls to media contacts, and her spiteful glances at Emma over the last few weeks, the truth hit him harder than any corporate betrayal ever had. "Why?" he asked, voice low and furious, and Rachel, voice trembling under her bitterness, admitted through clenched teeth, "Because you looked at her the way you never looked at me." Disgust twisted in his gut as he realized he had pushed away the one person who never asked for anything but gave everything because of someone else's jealousy he'd been too blind to see. Without wasting another second, he fired Rachel on the spot, his voice colder than marble, and began a frantic search, calling every contact, checking hospitals, scanning Emma's last known credit card activity, but it was as if she had vanished into thin air. Meanwhile, Emma scrubbed classroom floors for minimum wage in a rundown preschool on the edge of town, her hands blistered, but her pride intact, spending her days wiping paint off walls and her nights praying her mother's health wouldn't decline further. She missed Liam more than words could touch, missed the way he called her Emmy, the way he clung to her neck and played with her hair when he was sleepy, and every time she passed a playground, her heart cracked just a little deeper. At the Maxwell estate, Liam's world dimmed. He grew quiet, refusing to eat his favorite foods, tossing aside his toys, and crying at bedtime with the same word over and over. Emmy. The staff tried, Ethan tried, but no one could fill the void she left behind. And each night the house felt colder, lonelier, more like a shell than a home. Ethan stayed up late scrolling through Emma's old text messages, replaying the soft laughter they'd shared, her story about the lost child she once carried, the strength in her voice when she spoke of rebuilding. And it dawned on him how deeply she had healed a part of him he never thought would feel again. He walked through the garden one evening and stood at the spot where Liam had drawn hearts in chalk, where Emma had knelt down to kiss a scraped knee, where he once thought he saw the possibility of a new beginning, and he felt the full weight of what he had lost. But Emma didn't want pity or apology. She wanted peace, a sense of worth not tied to a man's opinion, and even as the media firestorm died down, she refused to read a single article, focusing instead on calming crying children, tutoring struggling students, and reminding herself every single day that love should never have to defend itself against doubt. Liam, meanwhile, slept with the stuffed bear she gave him, clutching it so tightly the stitching began to fray, and every morning he looked at the door, hoping she'd walk through it again. Ethan's calls to old friends, former co-workers, even to Emma's mother's clinic, led to dead ends, and desperation carved itself into every word he didn't say. Nights became longer, colder, lonelier, as he began to write letters he never sent, apologies too late, confessions too fragile for voicemail, each one ending with the same aching plea. Please come back. But Emma was building something again, not with bricks or marble, but with purpose and quiet courage, trying to believe that her heart hadn't been wasted, just rerouted to something she couldn't see yet. Love had begun to blossom, and now it had fallen, but even in the fall, it left behind the seeds of something powerful, something waiting for redemption. The air was crisp with December's chill, and fairy lights twinkled along the schoolyard fence, like stars brought down to earth as Emma adjusted the wings on a little boy dressed as an angel, gently straightening the cotton halo above his soft curls. Her hands moved with love, her eyes scanning the makeshift auditorium filled with folding chairs and proud parents, unaware that someone from her past had just stepped through the back doors, heart pounding beneath a tailored coat, clutching a small boy who couldn't stop fidgeting in his arms. Ethan had searched for weeks, chased cold leads, knocked on doors, followed whispers through community boards, until finally a kind-hearted janitor at a public library had mentioned Emma volunteering at a local school. And now, here he was, standing behind rows of folding chairs in a room scented with hot cocoa, pine garlands and innocent dreams, watching the woman he doubted bring magic to 100 tiny hearts. Emma moved with quiet grace, helping a child in a wheelchair onto the stage, guiding a shy girl with Down syndrome toward the front, her presence lighting up the room more than the plastic stars overhead ever could, and Ethan's breath caught, not from nerves, but from awe. Liam, perched on his arm in a tiny red sweater, looked around, then suddenly beamed, pointing with both hands and shouting, "Emmy!" his voice cutting through the Christmas carols like a flame through frost. Heads turned, the music paused, and Emma froze mid-step, her eyes locking with the two figures she never thought she'd see again. Her breath hitched, heart stammering inside her chest, and in that fragile pause, Ethan stepped forward, eyes never leaving hers, every step filled with the weight of every mistake he had made. A volunteer offered him the mic, sensing something bigger than rehearsal was about to unfold, and Ethan took it, clearing his throat as every parent, teacher, and child in the room slowly turned to listen. "I know this isn't part of the program," he began, voice raw but steady, "but I need to say something, not just to Emma, but to anyone who's ever let fear speak louder than love." Emma's fingers trembled as she clutched a program sheet, her pulse racing as he continued. "I doubted someone who gave my son more warmth than I knew how to. Someone who saw my brokenness and didn't run, but stayed quietly, lovingly, until I was too blind to see it." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but he pressed on, lifting Liam slightly so everyone could see. "This little boy called her Mama once, and I froze because I was afraid that maybe, after all the walls I built, someone had reached the part of me I'd buried with my wife." Emma blinked back tears, her feet rooted to the gym floor, heart cracking open under every word. "Emma," Ethan said, stepping closer, "you weren't a chapter in my life. You were the rewrite. You changed me. You changed Liam. And I was a fool to let the noise outside drown out the truth I felt inside every time I looked at you." The crowd was silent, the kind of silence where every soul holds its breath, and Liam leaned into the mic, his small voice echoing louder than the grown man's confession. "I miss you, Mama." Emma's knees nearly buckled as a sob caught in her throat, the room blurring through tears she no longer tried to hide. She didn't move for a second, didn't speak, but then, as if gravity itself pulled her forward, she crossed the room in hurried steps, dropped to her knees before Liam, and held him with a desperation that only the truly broken and finally found can feel. Ethan knelt beside them, one hand on her back, the other holding Liam's tiny foot. And for the first time, the three of them weren't fragments of a story. They were the beginning of one. The crowd erupted in applause, some wiping tears, some cheering, others simply watching with awe at the rare sight of raw truth healing in real time. Emma looked up at Ethan, cheeks wet, and whispered, "Why did you wait so long?" And he smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Because I thought I was beyond redemption, until you proved I wasn't." They held each other close as the children on stage resumed their carols, the soft sounds of Silent Night, playing over a scene that would be remembered far beyond the night's snowfall. And as Emma stood with Ethan and Liam beside her, she finally allowed herself to believe in love again, not the kind that whispers promises and runs when storms come, but the kind that returns, kneels in front of the world, and chooses you all over again. As the last notes of the children's carols faded into the winter air and the school lights dimmed behind them, Ethan held Emma's hand like it was the only anchor he ever needed, and Liam clutched both their fingers with his tiny ones, swinging between them as they walked into a future none of them could have imagined months ago. The days that followed were full of quiet healing. Morning coffees shared over soft glances, Bedtime stories read aloud with Liam curled up between them, and sunlight finally warming the cold corners of the Maxwell mansion, which no longer echoed but now sang with life. When Ethan proposed, it wasn't on a grand stage or with a diamond the size of Manhattan. It was on the porch of Emma's apartment at sunset.
With Liam holding the ring in a velvet box and giggling, "Say yes, Emmy." And she did, not because of the wealth, but because of the man who had rebuilt himself, brick by vulnerable brick. They married beside a serene lake in Vermont, surrounded by pine trees and close friends, with Emma in a soft ivory gown and Liam tossing flower petals ahead of her, his laughter dancing with the wind. No paparazzi, no boardroom elites, just vows written from the soul, hands trembling with truth, and eyes that saw every scar as a part of their love story. Ethan's voice broke as he whispered, "Thank you for saving me." And Emma, tears trailing down her cheeks, answered, "You saved me too, by choosing me when it mattered most." The kiss that followed wasn't fireworks or spectacle. It was the kind of kiss that seals promises, the kind that tells the past it's forgiven and the future it's welcome. Back in Charleston, Ethan transformed the mansion, not with gold, but with meaning. Liam's drawings were framed like masterpieces. The dining room became a haven of family dinners, and the once sterile walls now glowed with warmth and color. But Emma wanted more than comfort. She wanted to give back, to give hope. And with Ethan's support, she opened a daycare center in the heart of the city, a refuge for single mothers struggling between jobs and dreams, a place where no child cried alone in a corner, and no woman felt unseen. She named it the Little Lighthouse because, as she told reporters on opening day, sometimes all we need is a small light in a dark place to find our way. The center became a sanctuary filled with laughter, stories, and handprints on every wall, each one a symbol of lives touched by a woman who once served coffee with a secret sadness in her smile. Ethan, now less obsessed with profits and more with presence, spent weekends reading to the children there, Liam tagging along, often correcting his dad's silly voices and making the toddlers squeal with delight. Life didn't become perfect, but it became real, with Sunday pancakes, rainy day movies under shared blankets, scraped knees that got kissed better, and holiday traditions they made from scratch. Every now and then Emma would pause, standing in the middle of her kitchen as Liam danced with his father to old Christmas tunes, and she'd whisper to herself, "Thank you for not giving up." Her journey from a lonely waitress with too many burdens to a mother, a wife, a leader, became a quiet revolution that inspired others, her story retold at women's shelters, featured in local papers, and most importantly, remembered in the hearts she helped heal. Ethan, too, softened into a version of himself he never thought possible, not because he had less responsibility, but because he finally understood what legacy truly meant. It wasn't in stock prices or company names, but in the way Liam's eyes lit up when he came home, and in the strength Emma carried without ever needing to shout. Liam grew strong and curious, a boy full of questions, stories, and the kind of compassion that only comes from being deeply loved, his childhood wrapped in the warmth his father once feared and his mother once dreamed of. They would walk together at dusk, hand in hand, and strangers who passed them never guessed the journey they had survived, only the love they radiated. And perhaps that's the most beautiful part of it all, that a crying baby in a corner booth led to a family that would change the world in quiet, steady ripples. Because when kindness is chosen over convenience, when love is louder than fear, and when hearts open despite scars, miracles aren't just possible, they become inevitable. And so Emma Collins Maxwell, a name once attached to a diner apron, became a symbol of what it means to rise, not by climbing over others, but by lifting them with you. And through her story, we remember that the smallest act of kindness, the gentlest touch, the moment you choose to see someone when no one else does, that might be the very moment that rewrites not just one life, but many. And as the stars stretched across their lakeside home one quiet night, Ethan kissed her.
Forehead, while Liam dozed on her shoulder and whispered, "You were always the best part of my life. I just didn't know it yet." And she smiled, replying softly, "And you were the ending I never saw coming, but always hoped for."